Elections were held in Lebanon on May 15 to elect a new parliament. These elections took place at a crucial time. The country is facing a catastrophic economic crisis, and the credibility of its political institutions is very low. The election results saw the Hezbollah-led bloc emerging as the leading player, although it fell short of a majority. What are the major trends that emerged from the elections, and how do we understand the political situation in its aftermath? Rania Khalik of Breakthrough News explains.
So in the Lebanese elections, in many ways, all sides won. And so all sides can claim a victory. Of course, the mainstream media was pushing this idea that it was a huge defeat for Hezbollah. That's not actually true. Hezbollah managed to maintain its support among Shias, or actually even increase it, and produce a huge turnout from their areas. The Lebanese forces, the sort of fascistic militia party that was one of the most violent actors during the Lebanese Civil War, and is heavily backed by the Saudis now, has been heavily backed in the past by the Americans, and in some cases the Israelis. They did manage to get more seats than before, but I mean, it wasn't that much of a difference. The Free Patriotic Movement, the FPM, not only managed to preserve itself despite like a years-long campaign against them by the international community, meaning like the West and the Gulf states, in an attempt to break their alliance between Hezbollah and its Christian ally. But for the first time, Gibran Bassil, the head of the party, actually ran alone. Back in 2018, he ran with Michel Aoun, who's the current president of Lebanon. But, you know, he clearly has inherited the party from Michel Aoun, and he did very well despite the campaign I mentioned. So unlike some other figures who won't be able to, Michel Aoun actually showed that he could leave this party as kind of a legacy to his son-in-law, Gibran Bassil's son-in-law. The ML party is guaranteed, of course, to be the speaker, have the speaker of parliament, Nabi Berri, because the speaker always goes to the oldest member of the parliament, who's a Shia, until they elect a new one. And then, of course, there's the civil society, sort of like, opposition parties that rode in on the 2019 uprising. They can also claim a victory because this time they actually won a few seats. So everyone can claim a victory, in many ways, except the Lebanese people, because nothing at the end of the day has really changed. And those claiming to be the change are actually not that different than the elites that they want to replace. And just to get a little bit more specific, I mean, from the point of view of the resistance, because this, of course, like I mentioned, has been the biggest overall narrative promoted by the mainstream media, is that, Hezbollah lost. But actually, from the point of view of the resistance, the election results were very good. Like, even though government formation and choosing the president and the speaker are going to be very difficult because no one really has a clear majority, unless the Saudis tell like the head of the Lebanese forces to compromise. Other than that, the Shias, they voted, for all the Hezbollah and ML members of parliament. It was clear support for the resistance. Hezbollah had originally expected Shia turnout might be lower because of people's frustrations by the situation in the country. But Nasrallah gave these 3 speeches, heading into the elections that really mobilized people and led to an increased turnout. And also, Hezbollah's enemies helped by saying things like they were going to break Nasrallah's neck and, break his finger and just like other things that riled up his base. And so Shia votes actually increased this election by I think it was 22,000 from 2018 to now. And this actually doesn't include the 9,000 votes that were canceled, the 9,000 Shia votes that were canceled in the Bekaa and in the South because people like made mistakes in how they filled out the ballots, circling names and making a check outside the box, or in some cases, like making a heart in the box, which is kind of funny. But the point is that it's really silly to call it a defeat for Hezbollah when they actually gain tens of thousands of more votes. And, in the past, Hezbollah faced clear, distinct adversaries like the Future Movement and the Lebanese forces. And this time they only had one enemy, which was the Lebanese forces. One interesting thing about this election is the sort of Sunni representation was divided among different individuals. So there was no real Sunni current facing Hezbollah this time. And that is because, interestingly enough, Saad Hariri, the head of the Future Party, the son of the Saudi-backed Rafiq al-Hariri, the former prime minister of Lebanon, who himself was once Saudi Arabia's man in Lebanon. He was, back in 2017, people might remember, Saad Hariri was kidnapped and beaten and humiliated by Mohammed bin Salman and forced to publicly resign. And so this time around, Saad Hariri seemed to kind of defy his Saudi masters for the first time and called on Sunnis in Lebanon not to vote. And this actually forced the Saudi ambassador in Lebanon to run around the country, essentially trying to pay people to vote, including to pay Sunni Muslims to vote for the Christian Lebanese forces candidates. So this was in a way kind of Saad Hariri's revenge against his torturer. So Hezbollah also gained members of parliament in unexpected areas. They have a Sunni in Baalbek. It's now with them. And now Shias have, a representative in Jbeil, which is a very Christian area. So, from the Shia point of view, if it was a referendum, then the, American Saudi project was shown to be a massive failure, despite attempts to find Shia alternatives and Lebanese forces giving money to people. And USAID money being channeled to various people. I mean, I'm talking about tens of millions of dollars, if not more, to try to defeat Hezbollah. The Free Patriotic Movement, everyone was expecting them to not have any seats in parliament this time around, but they had 24 prior to this election. Now they have 22. So in a 4-year international campaign against this party to try to break their alliance with Hezbollah, they just lost 2 seats. So despite sanctions and accusations and insults, this party still exists. It still stands pretty strong. So, all in all, this was, if anything, this proved that despite this international campaign to destroy the resistance in Lebanon, it didn't work electorally, despite all the gerrymandering, which makes, certain votes have more weight than certain votes in certain areas that tend to be pro-West, pro-Saudi, pro-LF. Despite them having everything on their side, the money, the votes, they still were not able to win a majority in the country.
The elections were held even as successive governments have failed to address the economic and social crisis in the country. These crises have been worsened by the Beirut blasts and the COVID-19 pandemic. However, these elections may not be followed by the immediate formation of a government. What are the chances of a government being formed quickly, and what kind of configurations might lead to it?
So in the prior government, the pro-Hezbollah coalition, the resistance coalition, had, I think, something like 68 seats. So they had a clear majority in parliament. And even with that clear majority, they were still unable to do anything to really address the economic crisis. Now that bloc has 60 MPs, 60 members of parliament, who are 100% with the resistance, which isn't a clear majority. So they have a plurality, but not a clear majority. So they'll be less likely to be able to address the issues. In fact, this parliament is going to be split between the sort of pro-Hezbollah side, the anti-Hezbollah side, and then certain parties and so-called independents who, will move from one side to the other depending on what the issue is. So it's going to be very difficult to get anything done in this parliament. But that said, the parliament in Lebanon has been pretty paralyzed for years now. They've been unable to really do much to address the country's problems because the country's problems aren't just about elections. It's not just about who's represented in parliament. It's about the overall structure of Lebanon, the economic structure of Lebanon, and not just the economic structure of Lebanon, it's about the region. Lebanon cannot be separated from the region. There are sanctions on Lebanon's neighbor, Syria, that hurt Lebanon on top of the sanctions that exist against Lebanon. The fact that Lebanon's neighbor to the south is a settler colonial state, Israel, that continues to be a major aggressor, is also a problem for Lebanon. And that's actually blocking Lebanon from accessing its own oil fields in the sea, is also a huge detriment to Lebanon's ability to deal with this economic crisis. And at the end of the day, it still has this very intense, oligarchic structure of wealthy people that run the banks, that run the country's economy. And their answer to everything is to privatize and take IMF loans, which is not going to save Lebanon. So at the end of the day, until those broader structural issues of the way the economy functions, without taking on, capitalism, the entrenched oligarchy, and the broader structure of imperialism that is actually behind these smaller structures in the country, Lebanon's not going to be able to make its way out of this crisis. So at the end of the day, this new parliament I hate to say it doesn't mean anything, but it's unlikely to do anything to save the country from hitting rock bottom.
Lebanon is a country where players like the Gulf monarchy have for long played a crucial role. The US has also seen it as crucial, especially due to neighboring Israel and its close ties with Iran. What are the investments such powers have made in Lebanese politics, and how have they played out during the elections?
So the Saudis have really put their weight behind Lebanese forces. Like Samir Jaja is their guy. They've kind of given up on the Sunnis because there's no figure that can really rally the Sunnis. And like I mentioned, I mean, okay, so during this campaign, the Saudi ambassador to Lebanon actually went around the country trying to get Sunnis to vote for Lebanese forces and even trying to pay them to vote for Lebanese forces. So that's where the Saudi backing is at right now, is behind this, fascistic Christian party slash militia. As for the Americans, I mean, the Americans in the Western countries have poured millions of dollars into certain individuals through their various NGOs and, outfits like USAID or the National Endowment for Democracy, specifically the National Democratic Institute. They spent the past, I would say, 10 to 15 years, particularly the Americans, trying to fund Shia alternatives to Hezbollah. But that has actually been a massive failure. And then you also had the US ambassador in Lebanon, running around kind of campaigning for this guy, Michel Maoued, who a good friend of mine in Lebanon calls the Juan Guaido of Lebanon. They poured $16 million into this guy through USAID and other outfits like that. And he was only able to win one seat in parliament. So that just shows you it's been a massive failure to try to gain, new faces to replace the imperialist order in Lebanon. And the reason the Western countries are even doing that, by the way, is because the old faces are so unpopular. The Saad Haridis and the Walid Jumblatt are so unpopular. They need new faces. The other avenue for trying to gain new faces of imperialism in Lebanon is the sort of independent reformist candidates. So you did see a lot of German money in particular, a lot of European money in particular, being funneled through NGOs for so-called civil society groups and civil society political parties. I don't even know how that can be a thing, but there are these sort of civil society aligned political parties that are very close to the embassies, the Western embassies. A lot of the German and sort of European money has been funneled to these people to try to get new faces to try to represent so-called forces of change. But when you look at the program these people want, it's not different from the former, LF sort of future party programs of more privatization and anti-Hezbollah, let's disarm them. So at the end of the day, the international community, the West, has been kind of playing the same game, maybe trying to find some new faces. But what we see is that despite the millions and millions and tens of millions, and maybe if you added it all up from years past, hundreds of millions, perhaps dollars that have been sort of poured into different political parties and candidates to try to shape the future of Lebanon over the past 20 years, it's been a massive failure because, like I said, Hezbollah and its alliance are still very popular. They haven't been defeated. They maybe lost a couple seats as a coalition, but they still exist and they still exist strong. So the West has utterly failed.